Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, like very black and white.
Right. Like you break your arm, you go in, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points out and says, there it is, broken.
And then they fix it. Simple.
Exactly. It's easy to treat because you can see it. But then you step into the world of human nature, of our deepest motivations, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
It's totally useless. The diagnostic landscape is, well, it's incredibly murky.
Murky is the perfect word for it. We are fundamentally complex creatures. And when we try to figure out what is actually wrong with the human condition, or like what the actual goal of our communities should even be, we almost always end up treating the symptoms rather than the disease.
We've been doing exactly that, yeah.
Yeah.
For centuries, honestly.
Right. And today we are doing a deep dive into 3 really dense missiological and theological reports that argue we've basically been misdiagnosing the human condition this whole time.
We really have been. And the stakes of getting this diagnosis right, especially right now, are just incredibly high.
Why right now specifically?
Well, because we're living through this era that is entirely defined by severe information overload. And this kind of grinding systemic burnout that just feels inescapable for most people.
Oh, totally. Everyone is just exhausted all the time. So let's lay out the sources we've got on the table today. We're looking at church activities and worship goal, which completely changes the game. We're moving away from this idea of the church as just some pragmatic, program-driven institution like a sociological service provider.
Exactly. And we're exploring this really radical idea that worship is actually the alpha, the omega, and the absolute engine of literally everything humanity does.
So if you were listening to this right now, maybe you're on your commute or doing dishes, ask yourself, what are the hidden cultural liturgies that are shaping your daily habits right this second?
That's the real question. What's fascinating here is that to get to the bottom of those habits, we actually have to start with anthropology, the study of what a human being fundamentally is.
Right. Because before we can even begin to understand the goal of a gathered community like a church, we have to understand the foundational wiring of the people sitting in the pews.
Exactly. And these sources demand a huge shift in our starting point. We have to move from focusing on what we think to focusing on what we love.
The Cartesian shift. I love this part.
It's so crucial. So we all know the famous quote from René Descartes, right?
I think, therefore I am.
Right. That is basically the bedrock of the entire Enlightenment. It assumes that human beings are primarily intellects.
Like we're just brains on a stick.
Brains on a stick, exactly. And the downstream effect of that philosophy is this widespread assumption that if you just give people the right information, the right data points, the right education, they will just naturally make the right moral choices.
Which, I mean, is obviously not true. I see this disconnect all the time.
Right, because human experience just proves it wrong every single day.
Like if the Cartesian model were actually true, if we were just these objective brains acting on data, literally nobody would ever smoke a cigarette. The data is super clear. It causes cancer.
Yeah, the intellect knows it's bad.
Exactly. Or like nobody would ever spend 4 hours doom scrolling on their smartphone at 2 a.m. The data says it absolutely ruins your sleep and your mental health. But we do it anyway.
We do it anyway. And these sources, drawing heavily on the philosopher James K.A. Smith, and also going all the way back to Augustinian anthropology, they argue that the Cartesian view is fundamentally reductionist.
We aren't just thinking things.
No, we are homo liturgicus.
Homo liturgicus, liturgical animals.
Exactly. We are desiring creatures. At our very core, we are driven by our loves, our affections, and these visceral gut-level habits.
So we are constantly moving toward whatever it is our hearts have decided is the ultimate prize, the good life, regardless of what our intellects are screaming at us.
Right. That tension between knowing what is right and actually doing what we desire, that is the crux of the human dilemma. And that brings us to this really foundational concept from a scholar named Harold Best.
Yeah, this quote acts like the gravitational center for this whole deep dive.
It really does. So Best defines worship not just as, singing songs on a Sunday morning. He defines it as the continuous outpouring of all that a person is, all that they do, and all they can ever become in the light of a chosen or choosing God.
Continuous outpouring. The research has this haunting line, nobody does not worship.
Nobody. It's inescapable.
That means the theological axiom here isn't that humanity should worship. It's that human beings are incurably wired to be continuous outpourers. Like you, me, the person bagging groceries at the store, at every single moment of the day, every human being is bowing down and serving something.
The faucet is permanently on. You might be bowing down to an artifact, an ideology, a political party, a relationship, or even just the self, or of course the creator. But the outpouring literally never stops.
So then the primary spiritual danger isn't that we might forget to worship or that we might just slip into genuine atheism, right?
Now, atheism in this framework isn't really possible. The real danger is that our unceasing worship attaches to a parasite.
Idolatry.
Exactly, idolatry.
And this is where G.K. Beale's biblical theology of idolatry comes into the picture. He introduces what the sources call the principle of resemblance.
Which is a brilliant concept.
It is. Beale points out the spiritual law that's just woven throughout the entire biblical canon. We become what we revere. We resemble what we worship.
Right, either for our ruin or for our restoration.
But how does that actually, map onto human psychology? How does that work in real life?
Well, Beale uses the prophetic critiques from Isaiah 6 and Psalm 115 to show the actual mechanism of it. So think about a literal, physical idol in the ancient Near East, like a statue made of wood or stone.
Okay, so it's inanimate.
Exactly. It has eyes, but it cannot see. It has ears, but it cannot hear. It is totally lifeless. Beale argues that if you give your ultimate allegiance to a deaf, blind, lifeless object, you essentially suffer a spiritual sensory malfunction.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, your internal world starts to mirror the object of your affection. You yourself become spiritually deaf, spiritually blind, and spiritually numb.
So the mechanism is emulation. Like, if my ultimate God is the accumulation of wealth, and wealth is inherently cold and lifeless.
Then you eventually become cold and lifeless to the needs of your neighbors. Your sensory perception of human suffering just degrades.
That is terrifying. Or, if my idol is social status, which is, incredibly fickle and constantly shifting, then my own identity becomes fickle. I become constantly anxious, just shifting my personality to please whoever is in the room with me.
Because you take on the characteristics of the thing you are bowing to.
Man. And this connects directly to the Apostle Paul's diagnosis of human ruin in Romans 1, right?
It does. Paul writes that humanity exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling created things. And because of this God replacement, the worshiper's life literally takes on unnatural characteristics.
They become foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless.
Exactly. The idol physically and spiritually deforms the image bearer.
This completely upends how we have to look at the concept of conversion. I mean, if humans are these unceasing outpourers who are being deformed by what we worship, then conversion can't just be adopting a new moral framework or deciding to join a new social club.
Right. The sources quote theologian Michael Lawrence on this, and he just sharply critiques what he calls the modern doctrine of nice.
The doctrine of nice. Or sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton coined that famous phrase for it, moralistic therapeutic deism.
Yes. It's this pervasive underlying belief that religion is essentially just a psychological tool to help you feel good about yourself and, be a polite, highly functioning member of society.
Where God is just basically a cosmic butler who just wants you to be happy and nice to people.
Exactly. But if you're listening to this, you really have to ask yourself, is your goal today to be a radically regenerated worshiper or just to be a nice coworker?
Because these reports argue those are two fundamentally different species of human behavior. True biblical conversion isn't just behavior modification. It is a structural earthquake. It's a violent realignment of the heart's deepest loyalties.
And the sources ground this historically. Looking at the Thessalonian church from Paul's letters, Paul writes that they turned from idols to serve the living and true God.
Which, back then, wasn't just a private intellectual thought you kept to yourself.
No, not at all. In the Greco-Roman world of the first century, idolatry was a fully integrated socio-political identity. The localized gods and the imperial cult, they were tied to everything. The economy, the meat markets, the trade guilds, the family structure.
So you couldn't just casually opt out. Turning away from those idols carried immense social and economic cost.
Absolute devastation in many cases. Turning to Christ meant severing ties with the very mechanisms of your survival and your social standing. It completely shattered that unholy trinity of me, myself, and I, and replaced self-preservation with this wholehearted, costly submission to Christ.
I want to use an analogy here to really ground this shift from the intellect to desire, because I think it shows how easily our loves are manipulated today. think about the algorithm of a social media feed.
Okay, yeah.
We often tell ourselves we are just opening the app to get information, right? We think we are Descartes' brains on a stick, just engaging objectively with data. But the actual liturgy of the app, the infinite scroll, the push notifications, the highly curated outrage, it is a pedagogy of desire.
Oh, absolutely. It functions entirely precognitively. Like,
Yeah.
before your intellect can even evaluate a post, that bright red notification badge has already triggered a dopamine spike in your brain.
Exactly. It trains us to crave immediate validation. It
Mhm.
trains us to constantly compare our mundane, behind-the-scenes reality with everyone else's highlight reel, or even to commodify our own lives for content. And the scary part is, it's shaping what we love and what we desire without us even consciously realizing it's happening.
Right, because it forms a habit in the body way before the mind can raise any kind of intellectual objection.
Yeah.
And that really highlights the vulnerability of homo liturgicus.
Hmm.
I mean, if our desires are that easily captured by the liturgy of Silicon Valley, how much more are they being captured by these broader cultural liturgies of materialism or nationalism?
Right. But I do have to push back here for a second. If we are entirely driven by these pre-concept loves and we are just constantly at the mercy of our visceral habits and the algorithms of our culture, doesn't that render the intellectual side of belief completely useless? Well, I mean, why are we even analyzing these massive theological reports and deep diving into doctrine if we are just these liturgical animals blindly following our gut desires?
That's a really fair question, and the sources do address this tension carefully.
Hmm.
They definitely aren't advocating for anti-intellectualism, right? Knowledge is absolutely vital. You cannot worship a God you don't know.
A false theological premise will lead to false worship.
Exactly. The issue the sources are raising isn't that knowledge is bad, but that knowledge alone is insufficient to cure disordered desires.
This goes back to Augustine's concept of ordo amoris, right? The ordering of our loves.
Yes. So ancient Greek philosophers, like Plato, they argued that moral failure was essentially an educational problem. It was just ignorance.
Like if you just educated people enough, they would naturally do the right thing.
Right. But Augustine looked at actual human experience and realized that people often know exactly what is good, right, and true intellectually, but they still actively, knowingly choose the destructive path.
Because the human will follows the heaviest love, not the sharpest intellect.
Exactly.
So the cure isn't just, a better syllabus or more data points.
No, the cure is regeneration. It actually requires the supernatural work of the Holy Spirit to intervene and replace the love of the world with an overriding supreme love for the Creator.
The intellect provides the scaffolding, I guess. It gives us the vocabulary of the gospel, but the spirit actually has to change the heart's gravitational pull.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so if human beings are fundamentally wired for this unceasing worship, and if our biggest problem is that our worship is aimed at these destructive idols, then the ultimate goal of the church cannot just be a pragmatic mission to save people.
Right. The mission has to be restoring them to their original doxological purpose.
Which brings us to what might be like the most famous quote in modern missiology. This is from John Piper.
Oh, yes. Missions is not the ultimate goal of the church. Worship is. Missions exist because worship doesn't.
Let's break down the timeline of eternity on that one, because that is a massive statement.
It is. Piper is looking at the grand, sweeping narrative of redemptive history. So things like missions, evangelism, church planting, mercy ministries, all of these outreach programs are actually temporary necessities.
Right, they only exist in this present fallen age.
Exactly. They only exist right now because there are human beings in the world who are not yet worshiping the true God. But when this age concludes, missions will just become totally obsolete. Evangelism will cease to exist because there will literally be no one left to evangelize.
The job will be done.
The job will be done. But worship abides forever. Therefore, the ultimate goal of the church isn't anthropocentric, meaning focused primarily on human beings. It is doxological. It is focused entirely on the glory and praise of God.
The research contrasts these two approaches brilliantly, and honestly, it explains so much about missionary burnout.
It really does. Because in an anthropocentric mission model, the primary motivation for outreach is, love for the lost, or a desire to save humanity from judgment, or alleviate human suffering.
And on the surface, that sounds incredibly noble. I mean, we should care about human suffering.
Of course we should. But the sources point out that human compassion alone is inherently unstable fuel for a lifelong mission.
It's unstable because human response constantly fluctuates.
Right. If your primary fuel for ministry is just your compassion for people, what happens when those exact people reject you? What happens when they mock you or exploit your charity or actively persecute you?
You burn out. Human compassion is a finite resource. When it meets persistent hostility over years and years, the emotional endurance of the missionary will inevitably just run dry.
This is where theologian Tom Wells enters the picture in the reports. He argues for a theocentric or God-centered approach to mission instead.
Contending that God is worthy to be known and proclaimed simply for who he is.
Exactly. His objective worthiness is the unshakable bedrock of the message. If the missionary enterprise is fueled by a zeal for the glory of God, that fuel is perfectly stable because God's nature never changes, regardless of how the culture responds to you.
You don't quit when the people reject you because your primary audience is actually God himself.
Right. And this theological distinction between human-centered and God-centered effort leads us right into the danger of what the sources call Unitarian worship, which is a really crucial diagnosis of our modern exhaustion in the church.
Okay, Unitarian worship. Most of the churches discussed in these reports would staunchly, officially defend the doctrine of the Trinity.
Formally, yes, absolutely. But practically, the sources argue they often default to the Harnakic model of Unitarian worship.
And how does that work?
In this model, worship is viewed entirely as a human transaction directed at God. Like God did his part by saving us in the past, and now he sits up in the heavens waiting. And it is entirely up to the human congregation to generate enough faith, enough emotion, and enough performative praise to bridge the gap and offer it back up to God.
Wow, it's like we are trying to power the entire city grid with our own little stationary bicycles. It all completely depends on our own pedaling.
And the burden of that peddling falls intensely on the psychological manipulation of the worship leader to somehow whip the crowd into an emotional frenzy every single Sunday.
Right, because if the congregation doesn't feel it, or they don't cry or raise their hands, the worship service is basically deemed a failure.
Which inevitably leads to severe performance anxiety, deep moralism, and just profound spiritual weariness.
That sounds absolutely exhausting, but true gospel-centered worship, the sources argue, is Trinitarian. So how does the mechanism of Trinitarian worship actually relieve that burden?
In Trinitarian worship, the church relies heavily on the doctrine of the vicarious humanity and the continuing priesthood of Jesus Christ.
Okay, break that down for us.
It acknowledges a really hard truth. Human beings, even redeemed ones, are deeply flawed.
Yeah.
Our minds wander during prayer. Our motives are completely mixed. We physically cannot produce perfect praise. But Jesus Christ, in his incarnation, actually stands in for humanity. He is the liturgos, the true worship leader.
The book of Hebrews talks about this, right? That he always lives to make intercession.
Yes. Through his high priestly ministry, he takes our broken, off-key, distracted, totally unworthy prayers and praises, and he sanctifies them in his own perfect humanity, and then presents them flawlessly to the Father.
So his perfect worship is actually credited to us.
Exactly.
That is huge.
Yeah.
When a congregation actually internalizes that Christ is the active agent mediating their worship, the paralyzing burden of performance just vanishes.
It completely transforms worship from this frantic, human effort to appease a demanding deity into a joyful participation through the Holy Spirit in the Son's eternal communion with the Father.
You can just bring your broken, exhausted self into the sanctuary and know that Christ is doing the heavy lifting.
Right. It allows for profound ontological rest. And interestingly, it also radically changes how we think about unbelievers attending a church service.
Oh, this brings up doxological evangelism. Edmund Clowney and Timothy Keller.
Yes, the worship wars. For decades, churches have fought bitterly over this exact issue.
Right, like, do we design a service exclusively for believers? Like, deep theology, historic liturgical structure, essentially inside baseball that outsiders won't get.
Or do we design the service entirely for seekers? Make it super accessible, strip out all the weird religious jargon, and format it almost like a TED Talk with a rock band.
And Keller and Clowney argue that this is actually a false dichotomy.
It is. You don't have to choose between a service that pleases God and a service that reaches the lost. Because when a church gathers to passionately and authentically ascribe worth to God, when they publicly rehearse the deep, uncomfortable truths of their own sin, their desperate need for grace, and the astounding redemption found in Christ, unbelievers in the room actually overhear this dialogue.
They overhear the gospel being lived out in real time.
Yes. By making the uncompromised communication of the gospel the entire frame and focus of the service, the church glorifies God while simultaneously dismantling the unbelief systems of the non-Christian heart.
Think about it. Authentic, passionate worship of the true God is inherently evangelistic because it vividly exposes the emptiness of the secular idols the unbeliever is currently serving. It just presents a vastly more compelling vision of the good life.
Exactly.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about God offering this compelling vision, but I have to stop here and press on something really difficult.
Sure, go ahead.
We are talking about the ultimate goal of the universe being God seeking his own glory. The church exists to give God glory. God's mission is to be glorified among the nations. To a modern, secular ear, a supreme being demanding constant adoration just sounds like a cosmic dictator.
It does sound like that to a lot of people.
Right, because if a human being walked into a room and said, "My glory is your only satisfaction, and I demand you sing songs about how great I am," we would literally lock them in a psychiatric ward for malignant narcissism. So why does the ontology of God change the psychological impact of that demand?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that God's pursuit of his own glory is fundamentally categorically different from human ego. Human narcissism is actually a pathology of lack.
Meaning what?
A human narcissist demands applause to fill a deficit of self-worth. They are parasitical, they have to drain the energy of the room to inflate themselves. But God has no deficit.
He's not lacking anything.
Right. He is eternally self-sufficient, infinitely joyous, and perfectly fulfilled in the eternal fellowship of the Trinity. He doesn't actually need our applause to be God.
So why demand the unceasing outpouring of our worship at all? Why threaten ruin if we don't give it to him?
Because of what he is offering in return. The sources draw heavily on Psalms 67 and 117 to clarify this reciprocal relationship between joy and glory. God's glory, which is the manifestation of his presence, his perfect justice, his unfailing love, and his infinite beauty, is the only thing in the entire universe that possesses the actual density to satisfy the infinite cravings of the human heart.
And since we are unceasing outpours, we are going to worship something.
Exactly. If God points us to literally anything other than himself, he is pointing us to an idol that will eventually leave us deaf, blind, and ruined.
So if God were to say, "Oh, don't worry about worshiping me, just go worship your career or worship human progress," he would actually be condemning us to that spiritual sensory malfunction Beale talked about earlier.
Yes. As the theologian Jonathan Edwards argued, God's pursuit of his glory is the pursuit of human gladness. They are not at odds. They are the exact same event. When the human mind finally sees and the human heart finally savors the supreme greatness of God, we experience ultimate joy.
So the demand for worship is actually the most loving, self-giving act possible because he is offering us the only source of true life.
Exactly. And this was the theological fuel for people like William Carey, who's often called the father of modern missions. It's also the driving force behind massive modern movements like the Operation World Prayer Guide.
Because they operate on what the sources call a God consciousness rather than an enemy consciousness.
Right. They don't just stare at the darkness of the world and wring their hands in despair. They are overwhelmed by the supremacy and victory of the slain lamb, and they just want the nations to experience that satisfying joy. They want to invite people to the feast.
That is a beautiful paradigm shift. But let's bring this down from the philosophical clouds to the ground level for a minute.
Okay.
If true worship is our ultimate goal, and we are constantly being deformed out in the world by all these false liturgies of consumerism and status all week long, how exactly does the gathered church fix this on a Sunday morning? The sources say it happens through intentional counterformation.
We have to look at the actual physical structure of the gathering, because our culture trains us every single day in these pedagogies of desire.
Like the shopping mall. The mall isn't just a place to buy pants. It's a deeply liturgical space.
Oh, highly liturgical.
The architecture, the lighting, the mannequins presenting this idealized version of the self, it is training your gut to believe that redemption is just one purchase away.
Or think about the sports stadium, which liturgically trains us in tribalism and collective ecstasy. To combat those incredibly powerful forces, the historic Christian worship service cannot just be a rock concert followed by a motivational speech.
It has to be a weekly embodied reenactment of the gospel narrative.
Exactly. And the text details a specific pattern for this, drawing on Brian Chappell's analysis of Isaiah chapter 6. It's not just a random order of songs picked because they sound good together. It's a psychological and spiritual progression that literally shepherds the human heart back to reality.
So Chappell notes that historic liturgy generally follows a specific narrative arc. Walk us through that. It begins with adoration, right?
Right. Adoration. The church focuses on recognizing God's supreme holiness and majesty.
And as soon as you see the holiness of God, it naturally triggers the next step.
Yes, confession. Seeing God's perfection inevitably illuminates our own sin, our finitude, and all our compromises with those cultural idols during the week. Just as Isaiah, upon seeing the Lord on the throne, cried out, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips."
But the liturgy doesn't just leave us wallowing in despair or toxic shame there.
No, the gospel immediately steps in with assurance. The leader declares God's pardon and grace through the finished work of Christ. The guilt is removed.
Which naturally sparks profound thanksgiving.
Exactly. And that prepares the heart for instruction from the proclaimed word, which nourishes the mind. This all culminates in communion at the Lord's table, where the grace is tangibly received, and finally ends with a commissioning of benediction, where the restored believer is sent back out into the world.
So by walking this specific liturgical path every single week, the congregation is physically and spiritually retrained. The bad code of the world is overwritten by the narrative of redemption.
Right. And a huge part of this physical reenactment involves the actual, tangible acts of worship, the ordinances or sacraments.
The source material is really fascinating here because it impartially breaks down how different Christian traditions view the mechanism of these physical acts, particularly baptism and communion. Because even though the theology differs wildly across traditions, the goal across all of them is embodied worship.
Let's walk through them carefully because the nuances matter. We'll start with the Baptist and Broad Free Church tradition. They classify these acts as ordinances. The terminology itself is important.
Right. They emphasize that these are symbolic rites, acts of obedience commanded by Christ, and public testimonies. They are often called visible words of the gospel.
And in this tradition, there's a really heavy emphasis on what they call soul freedom.
Soul freedom. Because they view the church as an assembly of convinced, regenerate believers, participation in the ordinances must be entirely voluntary.
Right. It is a conscious, cognitive act of a believer. This underscores a deep Baptist conviction that authentic worship cannot be coerced by the state, by the family, or by any church hierarchy.
Okay, then you move to the confessional Reformed and Presbyterian traditions. They shift the language from ordinances to sacraments.
Yes. For them, the water, the bread, and the wine are more than just symbols we perform to show our faith. They are actual signs and seals of the covenant of grace instituted by God.
Think of it like a king's wax seal on a royal document, or God putting the rainbow in the sky for Noah.
Exactly. The sacraments visibly preach the gospel, and Reformed theology argues that working in conjunction with the proclaimed word and the internal operation of the Holy Spirit, they actually genuinely strengthen the faith of the believer who receives them.
Okay, so moving to Roman Catholic theology, the mechanism changes significantly. The Eucharist is revered as the source and summit of the Christian life, and this relies entirely on the doctrine of transubstantiation.
Right. In Catholic theology, through the consecration by the priest, the underlying substance of the bread and wine changes completely into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ.
Even while the accidents, meaning the physical appearance and taste of the bread and wine, remain the same.
Exactly. Receiving the Eucharist is the highest possible act of worship. It operates ex opere operato.
Meaning from the work performed.
Yes. Meaning the sacrament is effective in itself, regardless of the personal holiness of the minister administering it. It unites heaven and earth and fosters absolute mystical unity within the church.
And finally, the Eastern Orthodox theology. They don't even use the Latin term sacrament. They refer to them as the holy mysteries.
Yes. For the Orthodox, the divine liturgy is a theurgic act. That means it is a cooperative, synergistic work between God and humanity, where the boundaries of time and eternity become incredibly thin, almost transparent. The Eucharist is the supreme means of theosis.
We really need to unpack theosis because that's a term that trips a lot of people up in the West. It translates roughly to divinization or deification, which can sound super alarming.
It does, but it's essential to Orthodox thought. Theosis absolutely does not mean a human being morphs into the actual essence of God. The Orthodox use this great analogy of a sword thrust into a blazing fire.
Okay, the sword in the fire.
The sword takes on the properties of the fire, the heat, the glowing light, without ever ceasing to be iron. Through the holy mysteries, believers participate mystically in the uncreated energies of God, His grace, His love-acquiring godly characteristics, and being transformed into His likeness, while God's core essence remains forever unapproachable.
It's just incredible to see how, despite these profound, centuries-old theological debates over the exact mechanism of the table, every major branch of Christendom views these physical acts as the absolute epicenter of the Church's corporate worship. We are not brains on a stick. We desperately need water, bread, and wine to anchor our faith.
We do. And to protect that epicenter, historically Reformed churches emphasize a concept called the regulative principle of worship.
The regulative principle, this is the strict idea that the Church should only worship God using the exact elements he explicitly prescribed in Scripture, right?
Exactly. So the public reading of the Word, preaching, singing of psalms and hymns, the administration of the sacraments, and prayer.
Now, some might hear that and think it sounds incredibly stifling. Like, why be so strict? Why not just use whatever innovative methods draw a big crowd or feel emotionally resonant to the modern ear?
Because human ingenuity, left unchecked, naturally drifts toward idolatry or cultural pragmatism. The regulative principle acts as a vital safeguard. The primary goal is actually to protect the conscience of the worshiper.
How does it protect the conscience?
Well, if a church invents a new, mandatory ritual that isn't in the Bible, they are binding the conscience of the believer to a human tradition. The regulative principle ensures no one is forced to participate in man-made inventions, and it ensures that the unadorned gospel, rather than cultural novelty, remains the driving force of the liturgy.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, and I want to extend an analogy about how this liturgy actually rewrites our internal code. Let's look at a specific, very common element of historic liturgy: singing the doxology.
Okay. Praise God from whom all blessings flow.
Right. I like to compare singing the doxology to a weekly software patch for a buggy operating system.
Unpack the mechanics of that. How does the patch work?
Well, think about how your phone gets super buggy when it hasn't updated in a while, right? The apps run slow, the screen freezes, it misinterprets your inputs. All week long, my internal spiritual operating system gets corrupted by living in a hyper-individualistic culture. I start misinterpreting my reality.
You start believing you're the center.
Exactly. I start thinking I am the center of the universe, entirely self-reliant, pulling myself up by my bootstraps. But then Sunday comes, and I stand with a congregation and sing the doxology. The lyrics summon all creatures here below and the heavenly host above.
And the software updates?
The software updates. The bug is fixed. It shatters my rugged individualism and installs this cosmic, interdependent worldview where I realize I'm not worshiping alone in a vacuum. I am stepping into a massive, perpetual stream of worship that includes angels, the saints who have gone before me, and literally all of creation.
That is a highly calibrating act. It habituates you out of your isolated self and into a Trinitarian reality. And this brings in the profound eschatological nature of the gathering.
Eschatological, referring to the theology of ultimate destiny or the end times.
Right. When you participate in the liturgy, especially the Eucharist, you aren't just looking backward at a historical event on the cross. You are looking forward.
You are participating in the eschatological banquet.
Yes. It is a foretaste of the great messianic banquet prophesied in Isaiah 25, where God swallows up death forever. It's exactly why the early church shifted their primary gathering day from the Saturday Sabbath to Sunday, the first day of the week, corresponding with the resurrection.
They called Sunday the eighth day.
Exactly. By worshiping on Sunday, they were making a massive theological statement. It is a symbol of the new creation breaking into our present, exhausting, fallen seven-day cycle. When you gather at the table, you are literally practicing for eternity.
But if we are experiencing this eighth-day joy at the altar, what happens when we walk out the church doors on Monday morning? Does it just vanish? Because if we just stay at the altar, if we just bask in the sanctuary and never leave the building, we've missed half the picture.
We've missed the entire point of the mission.
Right. The gathering is not an escape from reality. It is the fuel that propels the believer back into the world. Worship organically cycles right back into mission.
This cycle is beautifully encapsulated in the ancient Latin phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi.
As we worship, so we believe, so we live.
Yes, the liturgy isn't just a Sunday event. It dictates our ethical action in the world on Tuesday.
The sources outline 3 models for how churches historically try to handle this relationship between worship and mission. These are identified by theologian Thomas Schatauer, and they have massive implications for how a church engages its city.
The first is the inside and out model, which we can basically call the battery charger model.
Okay, the battery charger.
In this paradigm, worship happens strictly inside the sanctuary to charge your spiritual batteries, and mission happens completely separately outside. They're dualistic, completely disconnected. You endure the mission field all week just so you can drag yourself back to the sanctuary on Sunday to get recharged.
Then there's the second, the outside-in model. This is the attractional or sequel-sensitive approach that completely dominated the late 20th century. The entire Sunday worship service is reverse-engineered to be an evangelistic tool to bring people from the outside in.
Right. The liturgy is stripped down, made as palatable and culturally relevant as possible.
And the danger there is that worship ceases to be an end in itself. It becomes a pragmatic instrument. You are worshiping God not simply because he is worthy, but because you are trying to impress the visitor sitting in the back row.
Which brings us to the third model, which the sources argue is the biblical ideal, the inside-out model. In this paradigm, the liturgical assembly itself enacts God's outward movement for the life of the world.
Worship and mission are intimately united. You enact the kingdom at the altar, and you carry that exact same kingdom dynamic into the streets.
There is a beautiful, tangible example of this in the text regarding the copper relief doors of Wartburg Seminary. Have you seen pictures of these?
I haven't, but the description in the report was amazing.
So the artist sculpted followers of Jesus doing acts of mercy, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty. But the brilliant theological move is that the artist sculpted the food to look exactly like the Eucharistic bread from the altar, and the drink looks exactly like the communion chalice.
Wow, it's visual theology.
Exactly. It declares that the tangible mercy we show the world is just a natural, organic extension of the grace we received at the table.
The Eastern Orthodox theologian Ion Bria coined a phrase for this that I absolutely love, the liturgy after the liturgy.
That's a great phrase.
The dismissal at the end of a church service, when the priest or pastor says, "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord," is not an adjournment, it is a commissioning.
Right, because the Greek word liturgia literally means the work of the people. So believers are sent out into the public square, into their corporate offices, into their neighborhoods, functioning as priests to the world.
The Apostle Paul says this explicitly in Romans 15. He describes his grueling, incredibly dangerous evangelism to the Gentiles, not merely as a communication strategy, but as a priestly liturgical act.
Yes. He saw it as presenting the Gentiles as an acceptable offering to God. His mission work was his worship.
And this liturgy after the liturgy manifests as profound cultural resistance. The sources spend significant time on this, specifically looking at the practice of the Sabbath. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann has done some brilliant work framing the Sabbath not as a restrictive rule, but as a radical act of defiance.
He views the Sabbath as the necessary bridge between the first commandment, having no other gods, and the 10th commandment, not coveting.
Brueggemann traces the Sabbath mandate all the way back to the Exodus, right? God freed the Israelites from Pharaoh's Egypt. And Pharaoh is not just a historical figure in this context. He represents the ultimate system of endless production, brutal coercion, and perpetual consumer anxiety.
Right. In Pharaoh's system, your inherent worth as a human being is strictly, exclusively tied to your economic output. More bricks, more bricks, more bricks.
Yeah.
If you stop producing, you literally lose your right to exist.
And Brueggemann argues convincingly that our modern hyper-capitalist market economy operates on the exact same underlying anxiety.
It absolutely does.
So keeping the Sabbath is a radical rejection of Pharaoh's system. It's physically stepping off the production line to boldly declare, my worth is not tied to my output. I am not a machine. But let's get concrete with this, because in theory, that sounds lovely.
But in practice, it is terrifying.
Exactly. The sources provide a really fascinating case study of Singapore to illustrate just how difficult this actually is.
Singapore is a perfect example. It's a highly developed, fast-paced urban center known for extreme economic success. It transformed itself from a colonial outpost to a global financial hub in basically a single generation.
But that success came with intense pressure. It operates on a deeply ingrained culture of strict meritocracy, and this sociological phenomenon known as kiasu, which translates from Hokkien roughly to the fear of losing out.
And kiasu drives immense societal anxiety. Students are placed in these highly competitive ranking systems from a very young age. Professionals are under relentless pressure to perform, to work overtime, to visibly outpace their peers. The competition is fierce and constant.
Yeah. And the theological danger is that when those cultural values, kiasu, and extreme meritocracy bleed into the church, they completely distort the gospel.
Completely. Because if you spend Monday through Saturday being conditioned by your environment to believe your worth is entirely based on your performance and beating the competition, you will naturally approach God the exact same way.
You turn Christianity into a moralistic transaction. Like, if I serve enough, give enough, and perform well enough, God will bless me and secure my status.
Or it swings the other way into a prosperity gospel,
Yeah.
where God is basically reduced to a cosmic vending machine whose primary job is to reward your faith with material success, completely bypassing the theology of the cross, suffering, and marginalization.
Both extremes are fundamentally anthropocentric.
Exactly.
So in a culture driven by chiasir and relentless productivity, how does a church actually implement a true Sabbath? How do they practice this liturgy after the liturgy without the members feeling like they're irreparably falling behind in their careers or their academics? Give me a tangible illustration of how this works.
It requires a tangible mechanism of trust. It means the professional in Singapore physically closing their laptop on Friday night, knowing full well that their peers and competitors are working through the weekend to get ahead.
That is a huge act of faith.
It is. It means turning off the phone and sitting at a dinner table to deliberately waste time on relationships and worship. And how is that achieved without the person having a literal panic attack? By connecting it back to Trinitarian worship. Resting in a hyper-competitive city is an aggressive declaration of absolute trust in the finished, vicarious work of Christ.
It requires the church to constantly loudly proclaim radical grace, unmerited, unearned favor.
Yes. When a believer in a Kiasu culture ceases all economic and academic striving for one full day a week, they're recalibrating their soul. They are bearing prophetic witness to their exhausted city that God is not a workaholic and he is not Pharaoh.
He provides for the birds of the air, and he provides for his people. The Sabbath becomes a vital counter-liturgy that challenges the city's deepest anxieties.
We also see this outward thrust functioning beautifully in super-aged societies.
Oh, right. The reports dive into demographics in places like Singapore, Japan, or the UK, introducing this care as mission paradigm.
Right. In societies with massively aging populations, the church engages in what they call incarnational accompaniment. So, setting up dementia care, collaborating in public health, caring for the elderly.
And crucially, they don't do this just as some sneaky, pragmatic trick to corner vulnerable people and evangelize them. They do it as an essential mode of participating in God's own care for the vulnerable.
The care is the liturgy. The gathered church is propelled into the world for humble service, which then organically draws the broken and the lonely back to the table to experience the source of that love.
This maps out the complete organic, worship-centered missional cycle. Let's trace it. The triune God reveals his glory. Then the church gathers to adore, confess, and commune.
Right. Then the church is counterformed by the liturgy and sent out into the world as priests.
They enact justice, preach the gospel, and resist the idols of the culture. Then the nations hear, they overhear the gospel, and are converted.
And finally, they are brought back into the gathered assembly to add their voices to the doxology.
And the cycle just spins wider and wider, gathering more of humanity into the fold.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. Where does this spinning cycle of mission and worship finally land? What is the eschatological endpoint?
The sources take us right to the breathtaking vision of the New Jerusalem found in Revelation chapters 21 and 22. This is the absolute zenith of human history. John the Revelator sees the holy city coming down out of heaven, and he writes this incredibly startling detail. I saw no temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple.
That detail changes everything. If you track the whole of redemptive history, God's presence was always localized and heavily mediated. In Eden, it was restricted. In the wilderness tabernacle, it was hidden behind veils. In the Grand Jerusalem temples, it was guarded by priests.
These structures, these liturgies, these physical sacraments we've been talking about, they were the necessary scaffolding. They were the mediators between a holy God and a sinful humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the eschaton, in the eternal state, the entire cosmopolis becomes the Holy of Holies.
The scaffolding completely falls away.
It falls away. There is no longer a need for a priestly caste to mediate. There is no need for physical church buildings. There is no longer a need for the visible signs of the sacraments, the bread and the wine, because the shadows have finally given way to the blazing reality. Faith has become sight. We will eat with him directly.
And the Great Commission, the mandate to go and make disciples of all nations, is finally finished. Because there is no sin, no death, and no alienation left in the city, there is no more need for evangelism. Missions permanently cease to exist.
What remains is eternal, uninterrupted, unmediated doxology. The text describes the diverse nations and kings of the earth walking in the light of the city, bringing their unique cultural glory into it, perfectly united in divine worship.
Humanity's chief end to glorify God and enjoy Him forever is fully realized without any impediment, without any burnout, and without any competing idols.
It is an incredible, sweeping, cosmic reality.
We started this deep dive looking at the murky diagnostic waters of human nature, feeling exhausted by the culture and the constant demand to perform. But what we found in these sources is a singular, blazing reality. You are a worshiper.
You were made to pour yourself out.
And the exhaustion you feel isn't because you're broken, it's because you are pouring yourself into vessels that simply cannot hold water.
And recognizing that reality really does change everything about how you orient your life today.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We just talked about the eternal state and existence of unmediated, unceasing worship in a physical, resurrected city. If that is our ultimate destiny, how might that radically change the way you view the mundane, seemingly unspiritual tasks of your upcoming week? If every human being is an unceasing outpour, and if everything from baking bread to changing a diaper at 3 a.m. to writing lines of code in a cubicle can be done as a continuous outpouring toward a chosen God, what would it look like for you to consciously consecrate your most mundane Tuesday task as a rehearsal for eternity? How does your daily commute or the way you speak to a frustrated client actually become a liturgy of worship? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep pouring out, and we will catch you next time.